Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the library tour of Doom, where Lord Ganesha and I are taking you through a tour of what is going to amount to every book ever written by the time we're done, one book at a time, day after day, until you cry uncle. In today's book, we're going back to two dates, 1965, when this book came out, when London walked in terror, and the other date is 1888. The date of the Jack the Ripper murders in Whitechapel, in the East End of London, in the stews of Whitechapel, at the height of Victorian power, when a person killed and partially dismembered a canonical set of 5 victims, all of them women, most of them down on their luck women, in the heart of a very crowded area without ever being definitively identified, certainly without being apprehended, even though there's strong indication that whoever this person was, and some people say there was more than one person acting in tandem, there's strong indications that they were interrupted in some of their crimes, in some of their murders and dismemberings, that they were very nearly caught in the act. And there's plenty of eyewitness testimony, plenty of eyewitness descriptions, a little bit on the vague side, a little bit contradictory, but still not nothing. This is by an author named Tom Cullen, who not only researched murderers and villains for a large part of his career, but also sometimes was one. Quite a bit of that. A somewhat unsavory character who nevertheless writes fantastically well. Of all of the Jack the Ripper accounts, that's what this does. It basically just recounts what we know about Jack the Ripper, what we know about the area, what we know about the victims, what we know about the police investigation, what we know about the major suspects. It basically recounts all of those things, and of all the books that do that, John Sugden or Don Rumbelow or a whole bunch of other major Ripperologists, of all the books that do that, this is by far the most gripping, and without, in my opinion, sacrificing much in the way of forensic accuracy or anything like that. It's a terrific read, is what I'm trying to say. That's why it was marketed this way in America. The blurb says that it's the basis for the hit TV miniseries Jack the Ripper, which probably you don't remember, and it's just as well that you don't. It stars Michael Caine, who spends pretty much the whole of the show, it's like 6 hours, 8 hours, screaming at the top of his lungs. And you can tell by watching however much of it you can stand. He also gets his co-stars to scream back at him. You can tell that he's just telling them to do that. Off camera, he's just saying, look, we're going to do this scene over again. What you to do is yell at me. And leaving aside the conclusions that miniseries comes to, because of course if you're going to have a television miniseries about Jack the Ripper, you have to come to a conclusion as to who Jack the Ripper was. But leaving that aside, you just know when you're watching the miniseries that Michael Caine was at a point in his career or his alcoholism or whatever where he thought that yelling at the top of his lungs was good acting. He's had periods like that in the past where mumbling is good acting, and then somebody would change his mind, or when crying is good acting and then somebody would change his mind. But one way or another, you can ignore the blurb because the miniseries wasn't all that good. There has not, in my opinion, been a great movie on Jack the Ripper. Most certainly, including the train wreck that starred. Anyway, to get back to the subject, Cullen does a great job on this. And my paperback, I got it back at the time, and it is just falling apart. I have tried my best to be delicate with this thing, but I need another one, and I've never seen another copy of it. What I wouldn't give to find a hardcover of this thing with a dust jacket. Or I think there was a trade paperback, or maybe the UK edition that I think had a different title. One way or another, I've never seen it again, so I just hold on to this for when I have a yen to do a sort of deep dive into Ripperology. When I have a yen to read everything that I have on Jack the Ripper, I think the case is absolutely fascinating. And so does Cullen. He does it justice on every one of those headings, and is appropriately skeptical about everything, especially the suspects. Of course, when you're talking about Jack the Ripper, the number one thing you want is to know who done it, and we never will. Probably we never will, even though Jack the Ripper, again, like I mentioned, was almost caught, was certainly seen, taunted the police with notes and forensic evidence, even though the police interviewed everybody, had plainclothes people everywhere once the crimes hit the news, and once the Queen demanded that something be done. They were a full court press on the subject to try and get an arrest, and it never happened. But you have subjects like Montague Druitt, a fairly good-looking young man who was unstable. His own family thought he was probably the Whitechapel killer. But there are as many, Cullen goes through the marks that are against him as well as that are for him. Cullen can sometimes be a little bit purblind on the subject. I think the number one argument against Montague Druitt is that he didn't, outside the parameters of normal Victorian society, I don't think he showed much of a predilection for a kind of categorical hatred of women, and he doesn't seem to me to have any verifiable, documented surgical skill. And whoever committed these crimes displays a bit of that. It's certainly more than a normal person would display. It seems, this is one theory of the case, it seems to me, and to a lot of other people who've studied this material, that the person who committed these crimes was after something. Wasn't just slashing and hacking, but was performing a crude kind of surgery, which might indicate another person. There was another major suspect named George Chapman, who was Severin Kozlowski, a Polish man named Severin. He took the name George Chapman, and if I remember correctly, Cullen dismisses him as a suspect, as a serious suspect. Dismisses him much faster than he does, for instance, Montague Druitt, even though the killing started right after Chapman moved into the area of Whitechapel. He was relatively nearby to each one of the killings, and the killings ended when he took ship for America. And he did have the requisite surgery skills. He had been an assistant, a barber's assistant, a kind of assistant surgeon, and been certified for it. So if, for instance, let's just go out on a limb here and say, if, for instance, Jack the Ripper, whoever Jack the Ripper was interested not so much in, I mean, definitely interested in killing women, but also interested in extracting and making away with their uteruses, specifically, well, George Chapman, the so-called George Chapman, would have known how to do that in fairly short order. A normal person, give a normal person a knife and have them attack a woman who, in the dark in Victorian stews. Good luck with them trying to not only find the uterus but then extract it. And the killer did know how to do that, and that came out in the inquest. In several of the inquests, that detail came out. And also Frederick Abilene, who was the detective in charge of the Ripper investigation, and it was no dull knife. No pun intended. He was a pretty sharp cop, and he was convinced that it was George Chapman, and went to his grave believing that. And I don't think that should be easily dismissed as easily as Tom Cullen does. Also, Chapman was ambidextrous, and so was the killer. And that's an important thing. Most people aren't. One way or another. You see, you get into a rabbit hole with this. If you are interested in the Ripper, and I always have been, then it's easy to go down a rabbit hole and start consulting and reconsulting. And that, I admit, is part of the fun. If you can associate the word fun with such a macabre subject, that's part of the fun, is that you're in the comfort of your armchair trying to figure out who did this from all of the suspects and from all of the clues that are out there. You feel certain when you finish a book like this that there's enough information on this page to figure it out, which has led so many pastiche writers to pit Sherlock Holmes against Jack the Ripper because they were in London at the same time. The Jack the Ripper cases were making headlines all over the place. It's a natural draw for pastiche writers to say, well, if all the evidence that you need to find the killer is right there in front of you, then why didn't Sherlock Holmes? Surely there should be a story where Sherlock Holmes solves this problem. And there are a number of them. There was the late Christopher Plummer played Sherlock Holmes in a movie called Murder by Decree that came up with a solution that made me howl in the movie theater. There's a Michael Dibdin novel that I said about which the better. The only Michael Dibdin novel that I violently object to. It also came up with a solution. But one way, you will never know. There are all sorts of tantalizing hints here and there. I myself am in favor of George Chapman. I think if it was good enough for Abilene, it's good enough for me. But one way or another, that is your library tour book for today. It's a book that really needs replacing. I really need to keep an eye out for a copy of this, and I know that it will happen. The Brattle Bookshop here in Boston, a great used bookstore, they go out on buys all the time. All it will take is for them to buy either a collection from somebody who, in the midst of everything else they were interested in, was also interested in Jack the Ripper, and that suddenly they have 100 books, and this is one of them. Or somebody who got these old pulpy mass markets, fiction and nonfiction, just across the board, and had a huge collection of them, in which case this will turn up. So it will turn up. But in the meantime, that's your book for today. No idea if there'll be a serial killer tomorrow, and I'm hoping that there won't be background noise of my little schnauzer going absolutely crazy on the bed. It drives her nuts. When I sit here with Lord Ganesha, it drives her nuts because she wants me to be making these videos on the bed where she can join me and butt in and whatnot. And when I don't do that, that's when you hear her choking. Since she was a little puppy, the noise that she makes when she is interested or frustrated or whatever is a kind of choking noise. She's not actually choking, but that's the only sound effect, aside from furious growling, which is her way of saying she's happy to see you. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.